Hello and welcome to the video. So in this video, we'll go through step 25 of the walkthrough series, and we will connect our application to a remote OData service. So up till now in our application, we have been using invoices.json file as a data source, which is a local JSON data which we are using. But in a real world application, you will always be connecting to an OData service. In this case, we will connect to a remote OData service, and we will make use of the Northwind OData service, which is a publicly available OData service. So we will connect our application, we'll connect our SAPUI5 application to this remote Northwind OData service, and we will fetch the data using this OData service rather than making use of the local JSON data which we have. So you will see that the list of invoice items which will be displayed in our application, this data will no longer come from the JSON file. It will come from the remote OData service. Now to achieve this, to connect our application to an OData service, we have to make changes to the Manifest.json file of our application. In the Manifest.json file, we have this SAP.app attribute. Inside this SAP.app attribute, we will introduce a new property called data sources. And inside this data sources, we will mention the settings for our remote OData service. So we will provide a name. This is a custom name. We can provide any name here for the data source. And we will provide the other configuration details. So we will provide a URI. So here in this case, in the URI, we are providing the full URL of our Northwind OData service. We specify the type of the data source, which in this case is OData. And we also mention the OData version, which is 2.0 in our example. So this is how we provide the configuration details for the OData service, which we want to connect to. Now going further down in our manifest.json file, inside the models, so we already have this invoice model defined in our manifest.json file. Earlier in the invoice model, we were pointing it to the invoices.json file. If I show you the manifest.json file of the previous step, you can see that this invoice model was pointing to the invoices.json file. So in the URI section, we specified the JSON file name, and we provided the type of the model as JSON model. But now when we are connecting to a remote OData service, the invoice model configuration will change. And inside this invoice model, we'll provide the data source property, and the data source will have the value invoice remote. And this invoice remote is the data source which we have defined inside the sap.app section of our manifest.json file. So these are the two changes which we need to do to connect to this remote OData service from our UI5 application. With this configuration, what will happen is that the component of our application will automatically create an instance of the OData service for this V2 version for this particular OData service. And this OData model will be available in our application via this named model called invoice. So that is what the component will do. And the component will make use of this configuration which we have maintained in the manifest.json file. So here I have already made the changes in the manifest file, provided the data sources here, and also made the required change in the models section. So now we'll run the application. So we see here that when we run this application after making the changes in the manifest file, that we can't see any data here. No data is being retrieved from the remote OData service. So what is the reason for that? If we check in the console, in the debugger tools, we see that there is an error which says that request at this particular Northwind OData service URL from origin. Origin is our local host, which is basically the web server running in our local system. This request has been blocked by CORS policy. So what has happened is, because our application is running on our local host with this URL, http localhost 8080, but the data source which we are requesting is a different remote URL. So because these two links are different, so because of that reason, the access to the data source has been blocked. So here it has been mentioned that response to pre-flight request doesn't pass access control check. No access control allow origin header is present on the requested resource. And it has been mentioned here in the documentation also that due to the so-called same origin policy, browsers deny Ajax request to service endpoints in case the service endpoint has a different domain, subdomain, protocol, or port than the app. So in our case, the app is having this URL, which has a particular port number, domain, and subdomain, whereas the remote OData service has a different domain, subdomain, and port value. So that is the reason this access to the remote OData service has been blocked. It says that the browser refuses to connect to a remote URL directly for security reasons. So that is the reason why we are not able to see any data on the screen. Now there is a workaround available for us to make this application work and to connect to the OData service. To do that, we'll be making some changes in our Manifest.json file. First of all, we will change the URI of our OData service to something like this. Now, because we change the URI of the OData service from the absolute full URL to a relative URL, this will make sure that the request to the remote OData service gets triggered from our localhost domain itself. And for the application to redirect to the absolute OData service URL, we have to make some changes in the UI5.yaml file, where we introduce some server configuration with custom middleware. And here we make use of this Fury Tools proxy. And here we mention a configuration for backend. So here you can see we have this configuration for backend, and we have mentioned here that if the path is /v2, then it has to be redirected to this particular absolute URL. So you can see that in the URI of our data sources, this is how we have given the relative path of the OData service starting with /v2. So what the application will do is that the proxy server will identify that the application is trying to access a URL starting with /v2. The proxy server will then redirect this relative URL to the absolute URL of the remote OData service. One more thing which we have to do is for the application to be able to use this proxy, we have to change the package.json file and we have to add these dependencies. So once we have added these dependencies and we have to run npm install command. So npm install command will install all these dependencies which are updated in the package.json file. So once that is done and you have this custom middleware configuration updated in your UI5.yaml file, then we can provide a relative path in the manifest.json file for our remote OData service. So once all this configuration is done, we'll run the application again. Now you can see that the application is able to connect to the remote Northwind OData service and fetching the corresponding data for our invoice list items. Also, we don't see any course related error which we were getting earlier. One more thing which I want to highlight here is that you see that the request URL which is getting triggered for the OData service is starting with HTTP localhost 8080, and then it is getting appended with /v2/northwind. So this is happening because we have mentioned the URI path as a relative URI path starting with /v2. And after that, the proxy server is taking care of redirecting this localhost URL to the actual URL of our backend OData service. So if we double click here, we can see that this localhost related URL is actually able to retrieve the entire metadata of our remote OData service. So that is it for this video for step 25. Now we have been able to connect our SAP UI5 application to a remote OData service, and we are no longer dependent on a local invoice.json file as our data source. In the next video, we'll go through step 26 and understand about mock server configuration. Till then, thank you for watching the video and have a nice day.